Up next, Keith Windschuttle discusses some of the major themes in his book, The Killing of History, How Literary Critics and Social Theorists Are Murdering Our Past. The book was first published in Australia in 1996. Encounter Books has recently published the paperback version in the U.S. Mr. Windschuttle's remarks are about an hour.
Well, welcome, everybody. Just while I'm not nervous and speaking in front of a large crowd, but I'd like to welcome you here tonight, and we'll think of quality rather than quantity. And before Keith comes up and gives his talk, I'll introduce you to Roger Kimball, the editor of New Criterion and a fellow author and friend. And he's going to tell you about Keith Windshuttle. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Among the very good advice that Samuel Johnson gave to people, he once gave this advice to parents. He said, always accustom yourselves, if a thing happened at one window and your children, when relating it, say that it happened at another window, do not let it pass, but check it instantly, because you never know where deviation from truth will stop. Well, one place that it stops is in the utter corruption of the very idea of truth, of factual truth, in the academy. We have today, in many, I've ventured to say, in most universities, a kind of taken for granted attitude that there is no really such thing as a fact. There are matters of opinion. This is a corrosive inheritance from a number of intellectual sources, all of which Keith Windschuttle details brilliantly in his book, The Killing of History. Now, I hope all of you have heard of this book and that many of you have bought it. Those of you who have not bought it, you now have the opportunity to do so in the economically priced paperback. You also can read Mr. Windschuttle in the current issue of the New Criterion, where he writes about the British Empire and disabuses the innocent reader of the prevalent but poisonous idea that somehow British imperialism was a wicked thing. Apart from the academy, this moral perversity and intellectual dishonesty that we see with the rejection of the idea of factual truth, it also has had a very corrosive influence on our public life, on our media, even on certain political figures who, when charged with gross misbehavior, think that they can cheat the charge of perjury by saying that it all depends on what the meaning of the word is. I mention this last fact because we shouldn't think that the kinds of intellectual dishonesty that Mr. Windschuttle chronicles brilliantly in The Killing of History are only a matter of airy academic speculation. They affect public discourse in the most intimate possible way. And it is Mr. Windschuttle's great accomplishment in this book to have laid out in a series of telling and vivid anecdotes the entire history of how this attack on factual truth and the undermining of historical truth has come about. Keith Windschuttle.
Thanks, Roger. I should say that this paperback edition, indeed none of the American editions of The Killing of History would exist if it wasn't for Roger, because he was the one who picked up the book, so he tells me, from a pile of used books that were destined to go to a second-hand bookstore, and flicking through the pages thought, oh, this sounds interesting, and eventually ended up writing a review for the Wall Street Journal, which sort of made the sales go through the roof almost immediately, and which led to an American publisher taking up the book, free press, in hardback, and now the book has been taken up by Encounter Books in a paperback edition, which is what I'm here to introduce tonight. So I owe a great debt to Roger and to the New Criterion for giving a little Aussie battler that kind of first-rate, often running start in the United States very competitive book market. I'd also like to thank the Australian Consul for this venue tonight, which is just perfect for what we want to do here. Now, I was in San Francisco the week before I came here, and doing a series of radio interviews with talkback hosts, and one of them started off by reading to me from the introduction my little brief statement of the various theories that I'm criticising. And he read, so I see you're talking about cultural relativism, semiotics, structuralist theory, post-structuralist theory, anti-humanism, discourse theory, Hegelian and Marxist philosophy, postmodernist philosophy, radical skepticism, hermeneutics, the theory of poetics. He said, now what the hell does that all mean? And as you might imagine, there was a couple of seconds of absolute dead silence on his radio program, because how do you respond to that kind of question when you think, should I start saying, well, now, structuralist theory, and running through the various points there, or post-structuralist theory, should I respond to that? Fortunately, the idea came to me that that the whole range of the fact that there are so many theories that you can list that a book like mine is criticising is indicative of how much fashionable discourse, or how much fashionable theory there is in this whole business, which is sometimes called postmodernism, sometimes called poststructuralism, which is today goes under the general rubric of cultural studies. But the fact that there is such a range of different titles means that there's no stability in the various theories that my book's criticising. It indicates that the radical critique of Western society and Western ways of knowing, which is what my book is intended to counter, has followed a shifting pattern of fashionable changes over the last 20 years. The most devastating critique that a postmodernist can make of anybody is to say that his work or his theory is out of date. Now, in contrast, history is an intellectual discipline that goes back 2,500 years. The first true historian, in my view, was Thucydides, who wrote in 400 BC in Athens. And the basic methodology that Thucydides laid down then is still alive today. The techniques of history were refined in the early 19th century, largely in Germany by Ranke and his disciples, and put on a properly academic footing. But for the past 200 years, the methods of verification, corroboration, of documentary proof of the events you're talking about has been pretty much static. So in the market that I'm in, as a critic of what, in my view, are the dominant theories of how we understand history and how we approach the humanities in general, to take a critical stance against that by arguing from tradition, and especially arguing from history, which really has a very simple methodology. I mean, Thucydides said, the basis of his methodology was to, he said, I've never written in this book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, about anything that I have either not witnessed myself or not have heard from other people of whom I made the most careful investigation. Now, that methodology obviously is very simple compared to the theories of language and the ontologies and epistemologies that your average university student gets if he does a humanities degree and he majors in history today. And so to defend something traditional and relatively uncomplicated is really to put yourself behind the eight ball to start with, because it's very difficult to argue that you've got an interesting point. But it seems to me that the defence of the traditional methods of history, and especially of its pursuit of truth and objectivity, really goes to the core of what Western society is all about. And it's not just simply a method of one particular intellectual discipline, although it is that. It's also an idea that distinguishes Western culture from every other culture that human beings have ever devised. The idea that you can pursue the truth in an objective sense, that is free from the influence of the prevailing political system or free from the influence of the prevailing religious system, is a Western idea. Thucydides invented it, and it means that what you can do is to sort of look down from an outside position on your own society and be a critic of your own society. And that happens to be, in my view, one of the keys to the success of the whole Western cultural endeavour. Those who inherit those of us who have inherited the culture, that we can be self-critical, we are free to criticise our political system, we are free to criticise our religious and cultural values in any way we choose. There have been people who've been prepared to die to defend those principles. And so to see the university system virtually throw them away on the basis of fashion and on the pursuit of ever-changing theories is very disappointing. And what I've tried to do in The Killing of History is not only to point out just what's going on, but also to criticise the varieties of theory and the different epistemological and ontological approaches that are involved in the alternative views, that in order to show that in themselves they have no value, but also if we accept them, then we reject one of the basic premises of Western cultural life. Now, when that radio interviewer asked me what the hell is this all about, apart from fashion change, another thing it's about is the politicisation of an important stream of academic life. The theories that I'm criticising are not only part of, not only directed at history, they've been alive much longer in English literary criticism, and they permeate the humanities generally. In one way, they are a continuation of the critique of Western society by other means. After 1989, it no longer became viable to criticise Western society from a Marxist point of view, even though there are still people who adhere to Marxist critiques of Western society today. It became much more sophisticated to criticise it from a post-structuralist, postmodernist point of view, because then you are no longer tying yourself to what the postmodernists call the old meta-narratives of Marxism or of anything that might smack of support for the now defunct Soviet Union. But what we've seen in the politicisation of the humanities is instead of the revolutionary proletariat, which was the vanguard of history for Marxist theory, we've seen a whole range of groups who've become the subjects of these particular theoretical endeavours. In particular, the political identity groups. Postmodernism, post-structuralism, cultural studies, in a very profound sense, are the ideologies of the political interest groups, especially of feminism, of ethnocentrism, and of various romantic movements about indigenous peoples that have become prominent in the last 20 years. And the critique of Western society has gone hand in hand with the critique of Western ways of knowing, of Western epistemology. And what the argument has been is that people who are non-Western, who are non-white, who are from ethnic groups that are outside the realm of Western culture, have non-Western ways of knowing, and that the idea that Western ways of knowing, that Western history might be a universal way of understanding the movement of society, is simply hubris. It's simply a myth that has been concocted by previous historians in the days when history was a discipline that was only confined and only written by people in the West. And if the new identity groups, and they can be identity groups within Western society, or in particular they can be identity groups, Muslims or Indians, I mean Indians from India, who are one of the important groups leading this particular theoretical movement. They have their own ways of knowing, and they want to develop their own techniques of studying society and understanding how human society works. What I've tried to argue in this book is that even for those groups, to throw away the method of Western history would be to throw away the best tools that that people from non-Western countries, especially people from poor countries, have of understanding their own predicament and of working to get out of their own predicament. I mentioned the Indian historians. There's a group called the Subaltern Group of historians who argue that only Indians can write Indian history. And this is a corollary with feminist groups who argue that only women can write women's history. The problem with that argument is that if you flip it over onto the reverse side, it's arguing that women cannot write men's history, or the history about males. And non-Indians have no right to write Indian history. Now, some of the best history of India has been written by non-Indian historians. It's also ironic that the theories that the Subaltern Group use in order to reject Western ways of historical inquiry derive, in fact, from a different Western tradition, but a Western one no less, which is a tradition derived from the Italian Marxism of Antonio Gramsci. So they're applying a Western form of theory in order to reject Western ways of knowing, which is, to say the least, self-contradictory and an obvious recipe for confusion. I might give an idea of the structure of the book. What I didn't want to do in preparing a reply to a range of bewildering theory was to write a theoretical book. And I tried to look for examples where the theorists, or the theories that I'm criticising, approach the historical topic, and I wanted to treat that as to look at case studies, to look at the historical topics that they'd addressed, and then to compare that with the way that traditional historians had addressed the same topic. And I ranged through a whole range of historical topics in the book, from the conquest of Mexico, or in fact the earliest example I use is late medieval Europe, but the conquest of Mexico gets a lengthy treatment. The Battle of Quebec in 1759, the Mutiny on the Bounty, the foundation of Australia, the fall of communism in 1989 are all historical topics that I look at the theorists I'm criticising, how they have treated this subject matter, and then look at how a regular historian, a traditional historian, using the traditional methodology of the discipline, approaches the same subject matter to see who wins. And from what I've said so far, it's obviously no surprise that in every case the good guys win. The traditional historians come out on top, and the theorists are left with an embarrassing position. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is Greg Denning's book on the Mutiny on the Bounty, Mr. Bligh's Bad Language. Now, the reason Denning chose to write a book on the Mutiny on the Bounty from a structuralist theoretical position is because it's been discussed so often and so many times. There are more than 1,000 books on the Mutiny on the Bounty since in the little more than 200 years since the event occurred. There are 5 movies, 3 in Hollywood and 2 homegrown Australian movies on the subject. And Denning's point in sort of running through the range of approaches to the Mutiny on the Bounty is they all change, that there's no one particular view of the Mutiny on the Bounty, that early on in the 19th century, Bligh is the good guy and Fletcher Christian is a terrible reprobate who deserved the early death that he earned for his deeds. In the 20th century, Bligh becomes the bad guy. Fletcher Christian is the young hero who's subjected to an intolerable abuse by Bligh, and understandably responds as any freedom-loving man would. And Denning says that there are shades of difference all the way through over the last 200 years in the various other approaches to the subject. He says what this tells us is that in each era, or in each span of years, what people see in the Mutiny on the Bounty is what their own culture wants to see in the Mutiny on the Bounty. The differing interpretations don't reflect any changes in the Mutiny on the Bounty itself. They reflect the cultural changes of the people who are looking back at that event. And he argues from that position to a more general point is that whenever we look at history, all we see is our own culture reflected back at us. We can never go back and see the event as it really happened. The admonition by Leopold von Ranke, the great German historian who really defined the discipline of history in the early 19th century to tell history as it really was, is impossible, says Greg Denning, because we are all cocooned in our own culture. We can't break free of that. We are locked into our own cultural vices, and history is really about the present. To study history is really, and to study historians is really to tell us more about ourselves rather than about the events in the past we're looking at. And so we get an interpretation of the shifting views of the Mutiny on the Bounty from Denning to sort of try and establish that case. Now, as part of his argument, he argues that there was a view in the early 20th century, in fact up until the time he was writing in the early 90s, that Bligh was a sadist, that Fletcher Christian was perfectly justified in rebelling because Bligh used to flog the men and abuse them in a terrible way that was unconscionable, and that any true man would rebel against and would, terrible though the deed is, would mutiny against. And then Denning says, but this is not so. This is another myth. This is an illusion by previous cultural perspectives, and he gives us some data about floggings about all the ships that explored from the Pacific in the late 18th century, and he shows that because the records of floggings have to be kept by the captain, and they're well documented, and it turns out that Vancouver was the worst perpetrator of floggings on his men in the 18th century, followed by Cook, and Bligh, of all the English sea captains who explored the Pacific in that period, was the least inclined to use the lash on his crew. Now, Denning then uses that point that previous views that Bligh was a sadist is a myth as part of his general argument that we can't know history as it really was. Yet, of course, his evidence about Bligh using the lash is a piece of evidence about history as it really was. He relies upon an example from history that actually happened to argue that we can't know the history that actually happened. And as you run through the book, you'll find that this is a position that repeats itself in almost every example, whether the theorists be post-structuralist, structuralist, cultural studies or whatever. To deny the veracity, the objectivity and the truthfulness of history, they have to rely upon the fact that somewhere in the historical record there is truth, there's a platform of truth to stand in order to argue their position. Another historian who does the same thing is Simon Sharma, one of the best-selling historians of the last 20 years. He published a book called Dead Certainties in the early 1990s, which had two things which I object to. One was he invented part of the story. There's what purports to be an eyewitness account of the early stages of the Battle of Quebec in 1759 from one of the common soldiers, and the language is the language of a common soldier, and even the spelling has 18th century conventions built into it. And any reader who comes to this for the first time obviously believes this is a verbatim report that Sharma has discovered. It's only when you read to the end of the book and start reading the endnotes that you find that this is a composite constructed piece. Now, the main objection to that, as any reader who's been sort of seduced into the book would immediately tell you, is that it's dishonest. It's a con. You think that you're getting reality, and then you find all you're getting is a second-hand interpretation by a historian dressed up as the real thing. That's bad enough. But the real point that where Sharma is at fault, in my view, is that he argues, like Denning, that we can't know the past, that history is an illusion, history is a construction, that we are cocooned in our cultures and can't break free of it. And he gives the example of the famous painting by Benjamin West of the death of General Wolfe in the Battle of Quebec. And he argues that the painting, most people who see it believe it's a battlefield scene, sort of social realist, with Benjamin West holding his breast, lying stretched out, his officers looking concerned around him, but knowing that this is he's about to take his last breath. And Sharma says now, rather than being a genuine portrait of the battlefield, this, in fact, is an historical illusion. And then he gives a very convincing case of how the lighting of the painting and the staging of the characters in the painting resemble the conventions of the 18th century London stage. That the 18th century London stage put people in these positions, they stood them in certain positions to get a three-dimensional effect, that the lighting, the candle lighting that you get on the stage is the same lighting as the battlefield in Quebec reproduces. It's not the authentic battlefield lighting, it's a staged lighting effect. And so he says that all historical evidence is of this kind. It's all constructed and it's all distorted, and basically it's an illusion. But now, to establish that point, we have to believe that what Sharma tells us about the conventions of the London stage is in fact accurate. Because if his account of the conventions of the lighting and the positioning of the characters on the London stage is itself an illusion, which in his own theory, that's all we have, an illusion of an illusion, then why should we rely upon it? Why should we take his word that the battlefield portrait by Benjamin West is an illusion if the only evidence for it is itself illusionary? And in every case, the attempt to deny truth and objectivity, as I try and show in the book, falls under the same kind of logic. I mean, the worst example is Greg Denning, where he criticises the Hollywood movies on the Mutiny on the Bounty. In the 1930s, the Charles Laughton movie, Charles Laughton as Captain Bligh and Clark Gable as Fletcher Christian, it had Bligh returning to England after he lost his ship, and then refitting another ship, returning to the Pacific in order to capture the mutineers. Now, as anyone who's read the history of these events knows, the real person who came back to the Pacific to pursue the mutineers was Captain Edward Edwards, and that Bligh stayed at home. And Denning is very critical of this. He says, look, isn't Hollywood, I mean, it's very fashionable in Australia to sort of decry Hollywood as being all of American culture, and he's really saying, look, aren't the Americans hopeless at history, because you know, it was Edward Edwards who pursued Fletcher Christian, not Captain Bligh. But of course, somebody with Denning's view of history, that is, that we don't discover history, we invent history, we create it. He says quite openly, history is fiction, it's not a form of fact. Anyone with that view can't make those kind of criticisms. You can't complain if a different character is put into the historical record, because after all, the whole thing is an invention, and so why can't Hollywood invent its own version? Now, these are logical points, but if you think about it, it's not difficult to show that there are political points that the advocates of these theories also have to address which are no less edifying. Now, as I said before, most of the people who support the theories that I'm criticising do so on behalf of, speaking on behalf of various political interest groups, and the main ones are feminists, ethnic groups, and various other groups who are critical of Western society. And the argument is we can interpret history any way we like. In fact, let me quote you in order to convince you just how sort of stark the argument is. This is from the introduction to a book called The Postmodern History Reader by Keith Jenkins, and it's a book which is now a mainstream textbook widely used in courses in historical method in the American university system. And Jenkins says, such demystification can free up historians to tell many equally legitimate stories from various viewpoints, with umpteen voices, emplotments, and types of synthesis. It is in this sense that we can interpret the past any way we like, and it is in this conclusion which signals to many normal historians the end of their kind of history. Well, now, one of the problems of that view is if you simply use postmodern theory to justify feminist interpretations of history, that all men oppress women and the rest of that argument, then the people advocating this theory might be satisfied with that. But that argument also justifies, it sanctions it sanctions other views that the Keith Jenkins of the world might not find so congenial. Because those who deny the Holocaust occurred can use exactly the same argument. White supremacists can say, we have our legitimate views too, and we want to write history any way we like. If you accept that, then you have no political grounds in which to object to them. You can't appeal to truth, you can't appeal to objectivity, you can't say, well, the facts contradict your views. You are left, you throw away history, and that's why my book is called The Killing of History. I mean, history is not dead yet, because obviously if I'm using the examples of traditional historians to argue against these theorists, then there's still a body of work being written that is on the side of traditional values. But the people who, the postmodernist version of history fails to confront the fact that there are political views which it will not like, but which it legitimizes. And so far they have no argument against that. I mean, I haven't used the argument of the Holocaust in my book, but in various conferences the issue arises usually from the floor, and the postmodernists on the platform say, oh, now you're drawing extreme examples and let's have a sensible discussion here. But the logic of that position is still exactly the same as it was before the questions were asked. That interpreting the past any way we like goes for everybody, whether they are on the political side that you agree with or they are not. Now, I might just finish my remarks with a couple of points from the afterword. The invasion of theory into the humanities has been going on since the late 1970s. In history, it really only became a powerful movement from the early 1980s onwards. So it's been going for almost 20 years. And so we can ask, what are the actual material results of this? What are the real consequences? Well, if you look at university enrolments since the 1970s, you find that they've gone through the roof in the United States and in Australia. There's been a huge increase in the proportion of young people studying, taking university degrees. But if you look at enrolments in history, you find that they've gone in the opposite direction. At the start of the 1970s, there were over 45,000 undergraduate students in the United States taking history majors. By the start of the 1990s, there were only 20,000 American students. So that it's more than halved in terms of the number. In Australia, the results have been the same. history is being abandoned by young people in droves. Now, there are some other humanities which have been affected to a similar extent, and I don't want to blame cultural studies and postmodernism for the whole of this situation, but let me quote one of America's great historians, Van Woodward, who died last year, but before he did that he participated in a symposium where he expressed his own concern about the developments in his own discipline, which Van Woodward was, I think, 98 or 99 years of age when he died, and had been the leading figure in American historiography for almost all his adult life. And he cited the figures to an historical conference that I've just given you now, and he said, "I am of course aware that the radicals in cultural studies and their postmodern precursors are by no means the only causes for the decline that history and some of the other humanities have suffered in the academy in the last few years. But it's my conviction that unless we of the academy, here and abroad, muster the courage and find effective means to counter these forces, we face a shabby end to the discipline we have served and to any system of education that we can respect." And I think with those sobering thoughts I will end my talk and ask if there's any questions or comments that people would like to make. Yes. Roger, Kimball.
Yes, Keith. I wonder how you would respond to the position represented by someone like, say, Stanley Fish, who argues, for example, that there is no such thing as an intrinsic truth, and proudly declares that he himself is a sophist who believes that might makes right, and so on. I think that position is open to the same kind of logical objection that you pointed out, that of course we could ask, is the statement there is no such thing as literal truth itself a literal truth, and so on. And yet Stanley Fish does have an interesting wrinkle that most people who espouse this kind of postmodern skepticism about truth don't really indulge in. Namely, he's quite willing to say that it really is all a matter of politics. If your side is able to muster the votes, so to speak, to deny the Holocaust, then your side wins, and it's just too bad for the so-called historical truth. I think it's a cognate position to some of the positions that you ably dissect in your book, but it seems to me to be a slightly different position. I wonder how you would respond to someone who sort of granted your logical point, but then said that it didn't really matter.
Well, truth takes no account of democracy. Truth doesn't count heads. Even if there was nobody to vote for a particular proposition, if it was true, it would remain true. Look, one of the easiest things to do is to show that there are countless facts we know from history that are true in an objective sense, in an absolute sense, and let me take one of the most commonly known. The Japanese surrendered to the Americans in 1945. Now, every concept in that statement is a construct of language and culture. The idea of the Japanese as a group of people, as a society, is a cultural term. The Americans is a cultural term. The idea of surrender, military surrender, is a cultural linguistic term, and the dates obviously are an artificial construct as well. And yet the proposition is true. And it's true in any culture. It's just as true in Japanese culture as it is in American culture. It's not a matter of interpreting documents. Nobody's going to go back and look at the documents of surrender that was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor in 1945 and find they didn't surrender after all. I mean, there are variations on whether, in economic terms, the Japanese were better off having lost the war, and in some sense, people argue that the Japanese really economically won the Second World War, but they surrendered militarily. It's an objective fact. And I mean, one of the things that postmodernists believe is that history is merely a matter of interpreting documents, that it's a textual activity. But the end of the Second World War has got very little to do with texts and interpretations. It's an event that changed the world. It affects the way we all live now. It affects the kind of motor vehicles that drive up and down the streets below us. It affects the whole nature of Japanese economy, the relations between the United States and Asia, and it's affected the lives of hundreds of millions of people ever since. It's not something that that is simply a matter that is determined by historians. Historians report it, but they haven't been party to creating the event. Now, so getting back to your question about those who have the numbers, have the truth. As I said before, even if there were no numbers, even if suddenly everyone drank some water that leached their brain cells and there's a collective loss of memory of the whole human species, irrelevant. The Japanese still lost the Second World War. They still surrendered in Tokyo Harbour in 1945. It doesn't matter. If nobody ever votes for that choice again, the truth remains.
I was wondering, would you not agree that the ultimate absurdity of the post-structuralist position is brought vividly, embarrassingly into focus by the efforts to apply the same doctrines to the physical sciences and indeed even mathematics? I mean, isn't that the ultimate absurdity that leads from history to other, what we used to think of as truth or facts as we understood them before?
Well, of course. I mean, the only thing that, well, there's a body of theory that these days that argues that science is simply a construction, and that it has no more veracity, no more connection with reality than history in their sense. But of course, one thing that science has on its side is successful construction of the physical world. The fact that our computers work, that the aeroplanes fly through the sky, the bridges stand up, all that kind of thing sort of testifies on a daily basis that even though science may be an invention of human beings, it's got a fix in reality that actually works. There's an interesting debate on at the moment about the play that's currently on Broadway called Copenhagen, which I haven't seen, but it's about partly about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It's also about the making, or the German attempts to construct the nuclear bomb. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle has been responsible for more mischief, the name of the uncertainty principle has been responsible for more mischief than any other scientific principle this century, in my view. Simply by calling it the uncertainty principle. From some of the reviews I've read of the play, and I may be misquoting it, so if I do, then apologies to the author, but certainly some of the reviewers have got the idea that what Heisenberg said was that at the subatomic level, everything is uncertain. There are no points on which we can stand. The simple argument against that is is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle itself certain or uncertain? Now, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle actually says you cannot measure the speed and the momentum of a particle at the same time. It doesn't say that the subatomic world is fraught with uncertainty. But I'm told, I'm not a physicist, but I'm told by my physicist friends that of all the 20th century theories about quantum mechanics, that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is one of the most certain of them all. It's been confirmed by empirical studies time and time again, and it's reached the stage through corroboration and verification that it is a piece of certain knowledge. And to use it as an argument for uncertainty is an absurdity and a self-contradiction. But I mean, C.P. Snow's argument that there are two cultures, we have people in the humanities who don't understand anything about the sciences, is certainly still alive and well, and you have discussions of people who've come out of seeing that play who are quite convinced that Heisenberg believed that the world we inhabit is really a mass of uncertainties. Yes?
Do you find any difference between the Australian academic and intellectual atmosphere and that of the United States on these issues that you've been talking about?
Well, Australia, when I was an undergraduate in the 1960s, used to be a sort of Anglo-phile country. We took all our books and all our employed academics were from England. But since the 1970s and certainly in the 80s and 90s, partly to do with the availability of American books in our country. We have gone the other way, and Australia now is a sort of intellectual satellite of the United States. The theories that I'm talking about all became fashionable in France in the 60s and 70s. The United States really put them on the map and made several of their authors, like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, who spent some time in America. In fact, Derrida is still in the United States earning very high salaries. It made some of those Frenchmen very rich. Australia has pursued the French theorists through its American interpreters, and even though you can buy Foucault's books in Australia, most of the undergraduates who talk about Foucault are talking about some Americans' crib on Foucault rather than the original. Mind you, not that there's any greater virtue in reading the original. The cribs, in my view, are just as good. Look, one of the things I try to do in this book, just not to answer your question, but as an aside, is to sort of summarise in potted form all these various theories, to show their connections, to put them into plain and intelligible English, partly because I spent several years of my earlier life not as an advocate of all of them, but certainly as an advocate of one of them, which is Foucault. And I wasted, in my view, many years reading all this stuff, and I think to think of people becoming sort of as well as informed as you need to be to converse easily in the subject matter, you do need to spend several years of your life reading it, and to come to the conclusion which I came to, that the whole thing was vacuous, is something you wouldn't wish on anybody else. And so what I've tried to do in the book is to give a summary of the arguments, to show where they go wrong, and that's all done in a nice potted version in chapter 1, so that hopefully those undergraduates who want to talk about Foucault or Derrida as if they know all about it can do so without having to wade through the real thing. And that's normally that's a terrible way to behave, because you really want your students to read the primary documents, but in this case, the primary documents are not worth the effort.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, well,
Actually, I would like to just to follow up on what Mr. Olson was asking. If you could describe, you said that Australia is an intellectual satellite, using the word, of course, intellectual in the broadest possible sense of the United States these days. I wonder if do you discern any greater sense of resistance to these trends in Australia than here? I mean, with the exception of the people in this room and maybe half a dozen others, I think that intellectual life, at least in the academy in this country, has been supine in mounting any kind of resistance to this intellectual virus. Do you see any greater resistance in intellectual circles in Australia?
well, I'm more optimistic about American intellectual life than perhaps you are, partly because as a result of this book I've been asked to certainly go to a lot of American academic conferences. I went to one last year and going to another one next week, where I've been given a platform to speak, which has never happened in Australia. I'm in history circles in Australia, I'm persona non grata. I don't get invited to be a keynote speaker anywhere. In the United States I do, which is very unusual for an Australian, because usually it's very hard for any Australian academic to become a keynote speaker at an American academic conference. In terms of publications, most of the resistance to postmodernism again has come from America. I mean, the greatest bulk of that has been in literary studies. I'm thinking of the work of John Ellis and co. I mean, postmodernism not only goes into history and English literature, but it also has had a major effect on the law. But there's a very good book published by two American lawyers which argues against it. I was amazed to find a few years ago that Foucault is even now part of the academic curriculum in accountancy. I kid you not. I kid you not. In fact, in the college where I was employed in the early 90s, we had a woman.
Is that the IRS? Is that the Internal Revenue Service, or is that some other accountancy firm?
Anyway, I discovered that there was a woman who was doing bookkeeping in this college, and she was, and she saw all my books on Foucault, and she said, "Oh, you're a Foucault fan," and she said, "So am I." I said, "Oh, well, no, you know, no accounting for taste amongst accountants," and she told me she was doing a PhD on Foucault and accountancy, and not only did she do her PhD, but she immediately was appointed as a lecturer in accountancy at the University of New South Wales, where her supervisor, the professor, is one of the most enthusiastic advocates of Foucault in the whole university, not just in the business field. So don't ask me to explain the Foucault approach to accountancy, but it's certainly there. In fact, I've listed some of the. In fact, I haven't read them, but I've listed the references in the book to postmodern accounting. I'm sure there's a lot of scope for it to be a growth area. But really, I mean, the Americans who sort of made this kind of approach really popular and put, I mean, in England there were cultural studies theorists and postmodernists who found they were on the sort of margins of academic life for many years. It was only when the whole field took off in the United States that the English people in the field then became respectable, and then the Australian acolytes followed. But fortunately, the Americans have redeemed themselves to a certain extent because they've become the principal resistance to it. And although there is a book similar to mine, which is one form of promising, which has come out of England in recent years. But I'm the only person who's written an Australian book of this kind, and I must say that in terms of, well, the Australian sales have been okay, but in terms of population, the book's been far more readily accepted in the United States than it has been in my own country.
I do ask a question, Keith. Who is fighting the good fight in historiography? Certainly in this country, it's dominated by a wretched man named Hayden White. And are there other figures who are doing things like you? I don't think I know of any.
Who are doing things like me?
Who are protecting history as it once was.
The most heartening thing in America is the emergence of the Historical Society, which is a new organisation of academic historians. Now, the American Historical Association, especially its journal, American Historical Review, was largely taken over by the postmodernists, and unless you wrote articles replete with terms like discourse and difference and other sort of acceptable terminology, you just didn't get published. That's true in Australia in our principal historical academic journal as well. Now, there's been a resistance to this in the United States, and it's manifested itself in an organisation called the Historical Society. And the Historical Society is interesting because it's a combination of people who don't easily fit together politically, even though the postmodernist movement is generally a movement on the political left. It's also had a rejection from a number of, in fact, old leftists, and the Historical Society itself says in its literature, from Marxist left to neoconservative, we include everybody who simply wants to get on with the business of writing history. And now the United States is the only place where there's been that kind of physical, on the ground resistance to the movements that I've been talking about. And so, I mean, who these people are is, I mean, there's 1,200 members of the Historical Society, which is by no means large compared to the other two major historical societies, but it's certainly a very promising start. It's only been going for 18 months.
I just just have one question about the increased playing very loose with historical truth in American movies. I don't know if you've noticed, but I mean, it's virtually irrelevant what actually happened. The distortions are so willful, and I think some commentators have pointed this out, some reviewers point this out, but in general, the attitude seems to be, oh well, it's just a movie. Is this, in your view, a consequence of this essentially intellectually sloppy way of approaching history in general, or is it something else?
Well, it goes back long before the movements that I'm talking about were even thought of, even conceived. So it's obviously got longer legs than that. I mean, Hollywood operates on dramatic conventions, and one of the original points on which Thucydides based his approach to writing history was that he would eschew dramatic conventions. I mean, Aristotle said that when you, if you write a speech for a drama, you write it not as it was actually stated, but as it ought to have been stated. In fact, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, the events that Thucydides describes, he says, I described them exactly as they happened, but the speeches he in fact invented. And the most famous speech of all, Pericles' funeral oration, which was the basis of Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, was in fact written by Thucydides rather than by Pericles, in the way that he thought Pericles should have done it. Now, people who came after Thucydides said, well, Thucydides is breaking his own rules by adopting that dramatic convention. History should tell it like it is, rather than tell it the way it would be more dramatic to tell it. Now, Hollywood is a dramatic medium, and it goes by dramatic conventions. Although I must say, one of the best pieces of filmmaking, best piece of American filmmaking I've ever seen, is the faithful reproduction of Gettysburg, the film called Gettysburg, which is very long because but it recreates the battle scene. It's filmed on the battle and on the battlefield, and it attempts to be, apart from cutting and editing and shortening the whole thing, attempts to be to tell it like it is, in the way that if you were writing about it, you would tell it like it is. And it seems to me that Hollywood may well underestimate the market for veracity, for truthfulness. But you know, the inventions that Hollywood, I mean, it's often all you're getting from a historical movie is the name is the same as the event in the past, and everything else has been changed. Yes?
Is there an appetite for veracity among the students? Forgetting now the academic leadership, is there anything happening among the students?
Well, one of the heartening things, and this is again a United States phenomenon, is amongst graduate students, I get a lot of fan email. In fact, I've had one of the best reviews I had was on the internet from a graduate student at Berkeley. And what a lot of the graduate students tell me, I mean, it's the old story. If you have an orthodoxy, it breeds a heresy, and the young are most susceptible to the heretics, are excited by rejecting the views of their teachers. And I'm in a sort of fortunate position of being amongst a small group, obviously, but amongst some graduate students, a kind of heretical figure of which they approve, and who they can use to flay their superiors. The problem for them, though, is that with declining enrolments in history, there are declining academic jobs, and academia is a system of patronage, and if you don't toe the line of your superiors, you sort of decrease your chances of getting employment, and so in a shrinking market, to be a heretic is almost a sort of guarantee of unemployment. So I have a sort of ambiguous relationship to some of these graduate students. I like the praise, but I feel they will never practice as historians in the university scene because nobody's going to give them a job.
Well, Keith, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Keith, I'm happy to say that Encounter Books has made available some copies of The Killing of History, which you can purchase for a very reasonable price, and I'm sure that Keith Windshuttle will be delighted to inscribe it with best wishes.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you.
Keith Windschuttle has been a lecturer in history, social policy, and media studies at the University of New South Wales and other Australian academic institutions. Encounter Books published the paperback edition of The Killing of History.